I'm Congressman John Garamendi, and with me today we have men and women that are critically important to California and this nation. Joining me today is the head of CAL FIRE, Chief Ken Pinlot, Gene Wade Evans, Deputy Regional Forester, U.S. Forest Service, and Jim Keenan from the Bureau of Land Management. And from the public or the non-government sector, Dave Bichelle, President of the California Forestry Association, Ed Smith from the Forest Ecologist with Nature Conservancy, and Neil Desea, Pacific Regional Operation Director of the National Parks Conservation Association. We're all here today with a very important message. Wildfires are destroying America's forests. They're also destroying Americans and homes and communities across this nation. Each year we're seeing more wildfires all across the nation. We're seeing fires that are more intense, fires that are more dangerous and more deadly. Many reasons for this. One of the reasons is that the United States government has not been able to get ahead of the increasing number of fires. The money that's appropriated every year for the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and for the U.S. Forest Service has proven to be insufficient. And in order to meet the ongoing need to fight fires, the current law requires that those agencies dip into operating funds that are necessary for the ongoing forest health, funds that are necessary for the management of the forest, for maintenance, and for the protection of the forest. Therefore, we find ourselves in a vicious cycle. We find that the forests are becoming increasingly overloaded with fuel. We find that we're unable to reduce those fuel loads, provide the fire breaks, and instead the money is going to suppression. That vicious cycle has to stop. The President has proposed legislation that would accomplish this by setting aside a reserve fund. Congress has proposed legislation, bipartisan, focused on this issue. Mike Simpson of Idaho, a Republican, joining with Kurt Schrader of Oregon, a Democrat. The introduction of H.R. 3992 has both Republican and Democratic sponsors. But that bill is bottled up in committee. An effort was made during the summer to pass emergency legislation, some $600+ million, so that the fire services would not have to dip into their ongoing operations. That failed. And now as we enter the most dangerous part of the fire season, we find ourselves once again in a situation where the U.S. Forest Service, which handles over 82% of all of the fire funds, is having to shut down operations for maintenance, for suppression, for forest health, and prepare to transfer that money over to firefighting. A letter went out from the U.S. Forester that just landed on the floor. Went out on August 29th, directions to all of the U.S. Forest Service agencies across the nation saying, stop your normal activities, your normal maintenance, your normal forest health programs, and put that money aside, because we're going to need it to fight the fires for the remaining portion of the current budget year. It's not the first time that's happened. This has happened repeatedly over the last 12 years. $3.2 billion that was supposed to be set aside for forest health, for maintenance, and for the ongoing health of the forest, everything from campgrounds to fire breaks, has been moved over to fight fires. We have to end the vicious cycle. The legislation 3992 does that. The proposal by the administration in this year's budget proposal does it also. I'd like to ask Chief Ken Pinlot to explain the situation here in California, what he's faced with this year, and how he interacts with the federal agencies. Chief?
Thank you. Well, good morning, and thank you for attending today. I want to
put out a special appreciation to our Davis Mobile Equipment facility here for hosting us today. In particular, our mobile equipment manager, Jeff Cranfield, who helped all of us put this together this morning. Congressman Garamendi is spot on in the concerns facing California and the West this year. We are looking at unprecedented conditions throughout California in terms of the dryness of the vegetation and the erratic fire behavior and extreme fire conditions that we are seeing fires burn in this year. On average in the western United States, over the last 40 years, we have seen the length of fire season increase by over 70 days. That's significant. That means we're starting earlier and we're ending later in the year. And in many cases, like this year, we've never gone out of fire season in Southern California, and we actually had significant burning conditions in Humboldt County in January. One of the wettest areas in the country was seeing active large fire activity in January. And we were seeing these conditions across the entire state very early in the year. That creates a large number of impacts. Obviously, operationally, being prepared at the state and federal and local level to respond to these conditions, and the appropriate level of funding to meet that threat. What's important to talk about is in California, we have a very integrated response system to the fires across the state. And that's very integrated between the local, state, and federal agencies. Wildland fires, like most disasters, know no boundaries. With the landscape and ownership patterns across California and the values and assets at risk, one fire, whether it starts on federal land or on private land under the responsibility of the state, will quickly burn into other jurisdictions and across property boundaries and affect all of the agencies that you see behind me. So we all bring resources to bear every day to fight these fires, to initial attack them and put them out. What most people don't see is certainly on state protection areas, but on the other lands as well, we're responding to oftentimes on average over 200 fires a week around the state that nobody sees because we're putting them out at a very small size. CAL FIRE is budgeted. The governor has leaned very far forward looking at these unprecedented drought conditions as well as these longer-term climatic changes and recognized that we needed additional resources to match this threat. Governor Brown brought on additional resources early. We staffed, again, fire resources throughout the winter in Southern California and brought on additional firefighters to match this threat. But without the ability to have the funding at the federal level, it impacts state and local government. We can bring resources to bear. We all respond to these fires, but if any one of the elements, whether it's the state, local government, or our federal partners, don't have the resources to bring to this fight, it impacts all of us because then we all have to step in and it's a further drawdown of resources from the state and the local level to meet this threat, whether it's on federal land or not. Just as important, not having a solid funding resource for the fire suppression component then impacts the other program areas such as you heard, forest health, forest management, vegetation management. We will never get ahead of these challenging fire and vegetation conditions that we're seeing that are continuing to drive these devastating fires if we take the money away from the fuels treatment projects that are the very programs that will allow us to mitigate the impacts of these large devastating fires. So maintaining a strong response mechanism that does not impact fuels treatment and other critical program areas at the federal level allow all of us in the state across all landscapes to be effective at protecting the state's natural resources and the people and the infrastructure that are present here in the state. So again, critical in California that we continue to work together. The states had the ability to bring funding and resources and emergency funds to fight these extraordinary fires and the extraordinary costs associated with that. We absolutely support a mechanism that will bring the federal funding necessary so that our federal partners have that same ability to fight the fires and continue to treat vegetation and provide active forest management. So with that, I'd like to introduce Deputy Regional Forester, Region 5, Jean Wade Evans.
Thank you, Chief Pemelot. And thank you, Congressman Garamendi, for inviting the Forest Service here today on this important topic. As you've heard, over the last 20 years, a combination of changing climate, increasing population in those wildland areas, as well as the densification of our forests, have really created more intense wildfires that have impacted communities, and they've impacted critical infrastructure, and they've impacted the very watersheds that produce millions of gallons of water to millions of folks in California and across the country. At the same time, the cost of fighting these wildfires has increased dramatically. The seasons are getting longer and longer, and in fact, just yesterday we were meeting with fire directors from all over the country, and we just don't see an end to a season anymore in California. Neighborhoods, homes are being impacted regularly. At the same time, the number of wildfires has doubled, and the acreage that's impacted by wildfires has more than tripled. Yet, at the same time, we're using the same business model to fund wildfires. The way that we pay to fight these growing fires is fundamentally broken. We've been forced to finance wildfire suppression activities out of normal program operations. That's forest health programs, fuel reduction programs next to communities at risk, as well as watershed programs that protect that very water that's critically important to all of California. 2 weeks ago, the Department of Agriculture Secretary, Tom Vilsack, released a report detailing the impacts of this budget situation. They talked about the practice over the last 20 years of funding wildfires and what continuing funding wildfires this way will mean for the Forest Service in the long run. Since 1995, the cost to suppress wildfires for the Forest Service around the country has tripled. Since 1995, that's not all that long ago. So it's gone from 16% to 42% of the Forest Service national budget. This problem is expected to continue getting worse unless there's some different way to think about funding wildfire suppression operations. Thank you.
Dave Bichelle, the president of the California Forestry Association, is our next participant. David.
Thank you for inviting us here today. The California Forestry Association represents over 4 million acres of private forest landowners, almost exclusively family-owned forests that are intermixed with our national forests, our state forest system, and we are very much dependent upon the collaborative activities between the state, local, and federal agencies to fund both fire suppression as well as fire prevention. I'd like to thank Congressman Garamendi for inviting us here today and for pushing forward with this key issue, not for just California, but for the entire forests of the western United States. This past decade, fires have burned 50% more land than in the previous 4 decades throughout the United States. Large wildfires have put unnatural stressors on our ecosystems. Chasing fires is not sustainable, not for our forests, not for air quality, not for our strained watersheds. It's time that the federal government change the way we respond to these wildfires, and we must start with how we fund them. Wildfires are as much a natural disaster as hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods, and the federal government should respond to them in a similar manner. What's different about wildfires is the severity and damage of fires can be prevented. And guess what? It would cost us a lot less than suppression itself. Wildfires are pummeling the forest, destroying homes, farms, natural resources, wildlife habitat, and watersheds during critical drought periods that we're dealing with. Unfortunately for federal forests and the programs that provide treatments are robbed almost every year because of the growing number of wildfires. Maintaining our forests has never been so challenging, dangerous, and worthwhile. We cannot get by with just doing nothing any longer. Investing in our forests today while they are green and productive is a much better deal than dealing with mitigating the damages of a scorched forest. We urge Congress to pass this important legislation. Thank you.
David, thank you very much. Our next two speakers, Ed Smith and Neil Desai, work on the forest health. Ed with the Nature Conservancy, a forest ecologist, and Neil with the National Parks and Conservation Association. I'll have them talk about how important this is in both of those areas. So, Ed?
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you, Congressman John Garamendi, for the opportunity to speak on behalf of the trees of our great nation. California's forests are diverse and magnificent, home to the largest trees in the world and some of the most iconic landscapes. Forests cover more than a third of our nation, including about 33 million acres in California. Forests are critically important to human health and well-being. They store and filter half of our nation's water supply, and here in California, forests store and clean about 2/3 of our water supply. Forests provide jobs for nearly 1 million forest product workers, coast to coast. They filter our air, absorbing 16% of our nation's carbon emissions. And they generate more than $14.5 billion in recreation and other related economic activity on Forest Service lands alone. And across the nation, public and private forests offer more than 1 million square miles of outdoor recreation opportunity. And they provide habitat for tens of thousands of American wildlife and plant species. While some fire is natural, normal, and needed, our forests today are not in a natural state due to more than a century of misguided management practices, including the suppression of good fire. For example, the United States Department of Agriculture Forest Service estimates that nationwide, about half of the forested lands that they manage are in immediate need of restoration, an area about the size of the state of Oregon. The risky tinderbox that we have created is exacerbated by a changing climate, increasing the chances of unnatural megafires like the Rim Fire last summer here. Average fire size, as others have stated, is 4 to 5 times larger today than it was in the 1970s, and the size of high severity patches has more than doubled. The last 5 years, we've had 5 state record fires across the nation. And here we are marking the 1-year anniversary of the Rim Fire, the largest megafire in the Sierras. Fire season is 2 months longer or more, and fires are getting harder and more expensive to fight, as others have mentioned. However, we know that there's something we can do about this. We know that thinning works. We have proven time and again that forest management restores the forests that support our lives and livelihoods. We can invest in science-based restoration actions, including selective thinning and controlled burning. This proactive restoration work is much safer and cheaper than fighting fires reactively and saves lives and property. I moved from northern Arizona last year, where forest restoration work we helped with saved the towns of Alpine, Greer, and Nutrioso from the largest fire in Arizona's history in 2011, the 500,000 acre Wallow megafire. A recent local example of management that helps is the Oregon fire near Weaverville up in Northern California, where a controlled burn from last year slowed down a fire they are fighting right now, allowing firefighters to make a safer stand in protecting people and nature. But the scale of that work has to increase dramatically, and we need the financial resources to do it properly. In California, at least 3 million acres are in need of treatment, but fewer than 100,000 acres are being treated each year. We are not even keeping up with annual growth, and will need to expand our efforts at least fivefold to make a difference. But tragically enough, nearly every year we borrow money from forest health restoration and other proactive projects for land stewardship and recreation due to shortages in firefighter funds. We are robbing money from Peter to pay Paul. Here in California, the proportion of the Forest Service budget for suppression has skyrocketed from around 10% to 47%, almost half of their budget over the last 2 decades. While over the last few years, fuels treatment funds have plummeted by about 75%. Forest firefighting funds have increased from 10% to almost half of their budget, while forest treatment funds, the proactive work of thinning forests, has plummeted by about 75%. This situation needs to be fixed because the megafire problem is only getting worse. Given the status quo, the Forest Service estimates that nationwide by mid-century, 20 million acres a year will burn due to our fuels problem in a changing climate. We need to invest in safer, cheaper, ecologically based forest restoration, and the Wildfire Disaster Funding Act is an important part of that solution. So we urge Congress to act now and pass this important legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Garamendi, for your leadership on this matter that has broad ramifications for our environment and economy, and for our national parks here in California and throughout the West. The National Parks Conservation Association, on behalf of our more than 886,000 members, thank Congressman Garamendi and strongly support your efforts to see that the Wildfire Disaster Funding Act passes this year. As I speak, 4 fires are burning in Yosemite National Park. Earlier this year, the El Portal fire threatened Yosemite National Park, destroyed homes and wildlife habitat, endangered historic buildings and local economies. When the 4,500 acre plus fire was finally contained, the National Park Service was held holding a price tag exceeding $10 million. Wildfires like that one are emergencies that put us at the mercy of Mother Nature, the same as hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods. And it's time to take a critical step to providing financial wildfire response in the same manner as other disasters. It's time for Congress to pass this bipartisan legislation and join Congressman Garamendi in solving this real problem facing public land managers that you've heard from today. To demonstrate how outdated this current wildfire policy is, let's compare it to being a homeowner. As a homeowner, insurance is available for fire damages to my house. I don't have to rob my grocery budget to pay for a fire if I have insurance to repair the damage. But the national parks and other public land management agencies are not so fortunate. While an emergency account addresses the tornadoes and floods, they just don't compensate for wildfires. Instead, this outdated funding system directs the Interior Department, the Forest Service, to guesstimate firefighting budgets based on an average of the past 10 years. But anyone who remembers last year's Rim Fire and the severity and the increase in number of wildfires coupled with the severe drought conditions understands that this just doesn't make sense. The system is outdated and it does not work in today's world. And when funding runs out for such expensive disasters, our National Park Service and federal land management agencies have to rob their proverbial grocery budgets to cover the costs. At our national parks, which are already significantly underfunded, that means delays for critical upkeep and repair projects, including deferred maintenance backlog that exceeds $11 billion. This puts our historic landmarks, our visitor centers, our campgrounds, well-traveled park roadways at risk and will cost taxpayers more in the long term. This domino effect can have impacts to on-the-ground resources, visitor access, tourism, and resource protection. Our 401 national parks around the country welcomed more than 273 million visitors who spent $14.6 billion in nearby economies and supported nearly 240,000 jobs. Our national parks provide a $10 economic return for every $1 invested in them. Investing in our national parks is one of the smartest decisions a congressional leader can make today, and passing the bipartisan Wildfire Disaster Funding Act is one of the smartest actions that Congress can take this year to help our national parks, our national forests, our Bureau of Land Management lands, and other public lands. And so we thank Congressman Garamendi for his leadership here and for the dedication of the federal land management professionals behind me and those who work in the field every day. Thank you.
Neil and Ed, thank you very much. To wrap us up, and then we'll go to questions, is Jim Kina. He's the Bureau of Land Management State Director, responsible for a large portion of California, and faces the similar problem. Jim?
Thank you so much, Congressman. Well, let me go back to where we started as I try to offer an agency perspective here. And I'm going to talk about what Ken talked about. We have men and women that are dedicated day in, day out to fighting fire. They're talented people. They take care of all the logistics, the mobilization, all of those kinds of problems we know we can solve. We've got an all hands, all lands kind of approach to fire, particularly here in California, and the coordination relationships are healthy. We should all feel good about that, and we should all recognize every day and thank the firefighters for the work that they do. It's hard and sometimes hazardous work, but it's incredibly important to the communities, to the homes, to the cities, to the people, and it's also critically important to the landscapes around those communities that provide the amenities that give us the American quality of life. So let's go back to, and you've heard a number of descriptions of the problem, and let me add one more statistics to that list. You heard about the doubling and tripling of the number and the size of fires on the lands. 8 of the worst fire seasons we have had have occurred since the year 2000. So what can we expect going forward? Regardless of what you think the causal factors are, and there are a number, the climate change, the extended droughts that occur on a year-to-year basis and overlay in California for 3 years here in a row. But regardless of how you think about the causal factors, we know that we are going to continue to face a tougher and tougher problem. We are going to see increased fire intensity. We're going to need new solutions in terms of how we respond. As I mentioned at the start, we have the relationships and the talented people to solve those problems. But it does not make sense for us to finance this effort in the way that we have. That is the problem that we of the agencies have presented to our bosses. And not that long ago, Secretary Jewell came out to California, and she talked about recognizing these issues and problems and trying to create a national strategy that solves those problems. And we've seen some of that come into the president's budget as well. What we've got is an overlay of long-term issues and problems that relate to the watershed, the fuels that are available for fires, and all of the context around which our fire responses occur, and it's overlaid with the short-term need for us to respond to the fire we have. And when we have these extreme fire years or large and difficult fire events, they truly are an emergency. So that is the case we've been trying to make, and my thanks to the Secretary for her attention to this issue, and I thank the Congressman for giving us an opportunity to offer our views today. Your name again, sir? Jim Kenna. I am the State Director for the Bureau of Land Management.
We're now available for questions. Before we go to the questions, I want to thank the participants here. Particularly want to thank the CAL FIRE for making the facility available. So whatever questions you may have to any of us. We'll take them.